We're simply out of wood. It's just as simple as that. I had two senior executives come up to me, and one of them shook his finger at me, and he said, "Nobody has ever talked to me that way before." And I said, what do you mean? Industry had such a stranglehold on government that government believed everything that industry was telling them. Basically, industry was given carte blanche access and control over the forest resources in the province. I was invited to sit at one of the major licensees' tables, and he said, "So what do you think of that Forest and Range Practices Act?" I said, "It looks like you guys wrote it." And he said, "We did."
Hey everybody, welcome to the Cut Block. I'm Dan Pierce, and today on the show we have our very first interview guest ever on this channel, Mike Morris, who is the former MLA for Prince George-Mackenzie. He's an avid outdoorsman, a hunter, and a trapper. He had an extensive career as an RCMP investigator. While he was in politics, he was the Parliamentary Secretary to the Forest Minister. He was the Minister of Public Safety and the Solicitor General. And now that he's out of politics, he's an outspoken critic of the current forestry paradigm in BC and a champion for the latest science in forest hydrology. Mike Morris, welcome to the Cut Block.
Well, thanks for having me on, Dan. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. It's an honor to have you here. And so just to get things rolling here, can you give us a sense of your background as an outdoorsman, where you're from, what your relationship with the land has been like in your neck of the woods, and just like how those experiences as an outdoorsman have shaped your perspective of BC's forests and what's going on in the backcountry?
Yeah, no, good question. Good place to start. I was born in Quesnel, which is in the central interior of British Columbia, northern Caribou, I guess, for those that are sensitive to that down in the Caribou. As a young boy, my oldest brother used to take me out. He was 11 years older than me, and he'd take me out grouse hunting around Quesnel there. But I traveled extensively through the province. I changed schools over a dozen times, so I had the opportunity to live in numerous communities throughout the province, mostly in the northern half of the province, some in the Okanagan and Shuswap area. But I found solace in the outdoors. So there was a lot of trauma and a lot of different circumstances growing up as a youth, and the way I would deal with that would be to just go out into the wilderness and listen and watch the animals and just everything going on out there. So before I got married, I would go on hikes for a week or two all by myself, carry my rifle and my bedroll and whatever grub I had, and just go wandering off into the mountains 200 or 300 kilometers north of Fort St. James. And I thoroughly enjoyed that. I saw sights that the average person would never see. And the other part was, I'm in my 70s. I started my experience in the outdoors before clear-cut logging happened in British Columbia. So I was able to see what was on the ground as a young boy, the abundance of wildlife and different birds and animals and whatnot. And even when I first started hunting as an adult in the late 60s and early 70s, clear-cut logging wasn't all that predominant at that particular time. So I could go hunting in areas that had never been touched by clear-cut logging, which was quite an experience back in those days. So that just took me to appreciate what we had in the wilderness. But I started noticing changes as time went on, and I was out hunting in the 80s, and I started noticing some cumulative changes about that. I'm a professional trapper. I got my first trap line probably close to 50 years ago in the Fort St. James area, and I've been trapping ever since, off and on. I didn't trap as much as an MLA. I just didn't have time to do that. But that gives you another chance to understand the habitat and the wildlife and the biology around all of them and how they interact between each other and how they support the different species that are on the land base as well. And I saw a substantial decline in that. So that was a concern of mine, and it still is today. The loss of wildlife that we've seen, the loss of habitat that we've seen, and probably led to why I'm currently sitting on the Habitat Conservation Trust Foundation as a director.
Yeah, I can totally see how being out on the land and getting to witness the changes like that will really activate someone you know, into the person that you are today and the path that you chose and getting into politics. But before you got into politics, you had an extensive career as an RCMP investigator. Can you tell us a little bit about that history, that background of yours, and how it equipped you with just the deep investigative skills that you have today?
Yeah, no. So I joined the RCMP in 1973. Prince George was my first posting. Probably the first 20 years, I was significantly engaged primarily as a criminal investigator. So, I had hundreds, thousands of criminal investigations that I conducted during my first 20 years as an RCMP member, either as a primary investigator, later as a supervisor for criminal investigations, and then later on as a manager of criminal investigation units throughout my area of responsibility. But it gives you the ability to, and there's been some good criminal trial lawyers that helped me in my training to make sure that I stayed on that path, dealing only with facts and evidence, and that led to my the pragmatic nature that I have in approaching everything today. But everything is tested, and it was tested by hundreds of trials in provincial court, and then on to Supreme Court and higher levels of court. And that's the way I approach everything that I do today. I approach it like I am investigating it, and that I'm going to have to prosecute it or present it to a prosecutor to present in court. So here's all the experts that you need to answer these vital questions as to where, when, why, things happened down the road here. So when I finally got elected, I used to sit in the legislature, and I used to view the legislature as the courtroom. And when we were in government, I would view the opposition as the defense, and the speaker was the judge. And so that was the way I formulated my approach to everything there.
And what did inspire you to get into politics? After 30 years as a police officer, you had this whole other career as a politician. What inspired you to do that, and what were you hoping to achieve?
Yeah, good question. Politics was never in my bucket list of things to do. I retired from the force after 32 years, and my ultimate career goal was to become a grizzled up old trapper granddad. And I haven't quite got there yet, but I'm working towards that. I left the RCMP in 2005, and I didn't get elected until 2013. So in that interim period of time, I was trapping and I was outdoors. But I was on the executive of the BC Trappers, and in that position, I made presentations to the environment minister, to the forest minister back in the early 2000s over my profound concern over the cumulative impacts of resource development on the land base, and mostly to do with forestry, because forestry has the biggest impact on the land. And I was never satisfied. Just most people, when they go and meet with a politician, they get all these different answers that don't really amount to any kind of answers at all. So I had that sitting in the back of my mind. So at the end of the day, what really pushed me into politics was I want to go down and have a look at what happens in the Granite Castle in Victoria, find out where this big black hole is and all the stuff that's in it, and why nothing ever gets done. And so that was the impetus behind me saying yes to get into politics. And it's been the most frustrating job I've ever had. It's been very revealing on how things work. But so that's how I ended up there.
And what did you find once you made it into the Granite Castle? Tell us a little bit about your career in government as well as then in the opposition. And, just keep running through this story.
So when I got into, when we were elected as government, Christy Clark was the premier at the time, and she didn't know me from Adam, so I'm the strange face that shows up in her caucus. And so, obviously I wasn't expecting to get any kind of a particular appointment at that time. But within probably a month or two, I went to our caucus chair and I said, I'd like to make a caucus presentation on the impact of resource development on biodiversity in the province. And so I was put on the agenda, and I think I got elected in May, and I think September is when I made my first presentation. I had this beautiful PowerPoint put together and all the different stats on there. And I made the presentation, and my colleagues watched, and the Premier was there. The whole caucus was there. But I was focusing on how I'm going to present the biodiversity issue to give it greater light. And so I did that from May until the following fall of 2014, early winter, I guess it was, when I was approached by one of the deputy ministers for the Premier's office, saying that she'd like to appoint me as a Parliamentary Secretary to the Forest Minister to study wildlife habitat loss in the province. And I was elated over that. Once I was appointed Parliamentary Secretary, I had carte blanche access to any ministry within government, to all the resources within government and out in the field, all the technicians and whatnot. And I took advantage of that. I used a helicopter significantly throughout the interior of the province and the northern part of the province. I looked at forestry, mining, oil and gas, hydro, all the resources that we have in British Columbia, and looked at the impacts of that. And it was quite revealing. I formulated my response in a report called Getting the Balance Right in probably about mid-2015. And I had my recommendations to the minister. I had to call it advice at that particular time. They didn't want me to make recommendations, but I provided advice to the minister. And it was interesting. I had a senior bureaucrat with me all the time during that whole process. And if anybody looks at that report, Getting the Balance Right, it used to be on the government website, but they have recently taken it off. But it is available through the Evergreen Alliance, and some of the other websites still have it on there. But this bureaucrat that was with me took notes, and like I said, I spoke to dozens of experts in that. Previous foresters, chief foresters, the current chief forester, who was Diane Nichols at the time, and countless experts. And I reviewed legislation. I looked at a lot of different things. And it was probably during the summer of 2014 or 2015 when I was starting to ask questions that industry didn't like. So that led me to making a presentation to the Council of Forest Industries in the summer of 2015 on my findings. So I made the presentation, and I told Christy Clark what was going on. I kept her abreast all the time, the Deputy Minister of Forests all the time. I had lunch and dinner with the minister on a regular basis to update him on where I was coming from. They were very uncomfortable with the findings. And the bureaucrat and very nice lady, lots of experience, that had been with me the whole time, she had prepared my report. And I looked at it and I said, no, that's not my report. That's not what I want to say. So I was people were very wary of me after that. So when I made my presentation to the Council of Forest Industry, the Deputy Minister was there. Just about every executive and vice presidents were there as well, from all the members of the Council of Forest Industries. And it was very quiet. And what I basically said to them was, I have read your forest stewardship plans, and they have obviously been written by a professional forester, but they've been sanitized by your corporate lawyers. And coupled with that, I said, we have the Forest and Drainage Practices Act, which has been written by industry, very a big influence by industry in the way it was written. And there is, and with some of the way the regulations are written on that, there's basically nothing that can be done. I've been an enforcement officer for 32 years, and I'm looking at this, and there's nothing that I could do as an enforcement officer to change direction. So I told them, I said, you guys are in total control with this industry-led, market-driven approach that we've taken to forestry in British Columbia. You guys are in total control. The government has abdicated their responsibility in that respect. And if you don't start cutting back, pull the throttle back and cut at least half or less of what you're cutting today, we're going to be out of wood within the next 8 to 10 years, and mills are going to shut down. And it was dead quiet. You could have heard a pin drop in that room, and there was several people in there. And as the meeting adjourned, the deputy minister was very uncomfortable with what I was saying, and he kind of stood back, and I was there, standing out there by myself. I had two senior executives come up to me, and one of them said, and he shook his finger at me, And he said, nobody has ever talked to me that way before. And I said, what do you mean? And he looked at me and he clenched his fists and he shook and he walked around me and out the door he went. And I ran into him several times after that, but he never talked to me. And then I had the CEO of another big licensee come up, and he stood there and he looked at me and he called me son, but I think we're same age. And I always looked young for my age. And he said, we can sure as heck tell you were a cop. And I said, why is that? And he said, you tell it like it is. And I says, great, you've just validated exactly what I've been saying here. And he realized he had probably said something he shouldn't. And he walked around me, and I saw him many times at different meetings and stuff, and he never wanted to talk to me after that. So I got back to Victoria on the Monday morning, and I went in to see the Premier, Christy Clark. And I said, Christy, I said, you're probably going to be getting some phone calls. And she kind of looked at me and she nodded, and she says, Mike, I already have. And I said, what do you want me to do? And she says, keep doing it. She understood, that forestry had control. And she said, forestry needs to be held to account. So that was it. But then the pressure was on. The head of the BC Liberal Party at that time, or the head financial guy that was doing a lot of looking after the fundraising, was vice president with one of the licensees. And I'm sure there was all kinds of pressure put on Christy to get me the heck out of the forest ministry and give me something else to do. And that went on until probably December of 2015, when I was appointed the Solicitor General of BC. And I was called into a meeting, and I thought it was to defend my thesis on getting the balance right. And I started doing that for a minute or two. And then Christy said, no, that's not what it's all about. I want to make you Solicitor General. And I just about said no, because that would take me out of the forestry file. But I said yes, because I wanted to see, we're in this granite castle, and I wanted to see what happens at the senior level as an executive member sitting in council as a cabinet member, what kind of discussions took place on forestry. And I had that opportunity, but of course everything that happens in there is confidential. And the other thing that I didn't realize as much is that when you're giving a ministerial role, the responsibilities that come with that keep you occupied 7/24. So I had no time to spend on forestry matters. Even though I wanted to jump in from time to time, you can't criticize another member or another minister. And it wasn't until we were re-elected in 2017, and I was sole gen for about 2 months before we fell and the Green Party made the deal with the NDP. But once that happened, it was like I'm stepping out of a rut that's 4 feet deep and getting up on top, and I'm able to look around and see what's going on. And I started becoming a little bit more vocal. It still made my caucus colleagues very uncomfortable, but I started making more speeches in the House directed at the loss of biodiversity and the impacts of clear cutting and whatnot on that. And that's what I continue to do for the rest of my time as a member of the Legislative Assembly of BC. I got elected 3 different times.
Thanks so much, Mike. Before we move on to your time in opposition, and I want to talk about your report, We Can't See the Forest for the Trees, but before we move on, I want to ask you a little bit more about your time in government, because it was such an interesting time, and you had such an inside perspective of the bureaucracy, the government, and got to interact directly with some of these executives. And I guess my question for you is, this was at a time when we were sort of in the aftermath of the mountain pine beetle and the salvage logging that was going on to try and, ostensibly remove some of that dead wood to lower the wildfire risk. But also, in reality, it was an economic project to get whatever sort of value they could out of those trees before they rotted. And so the annual allowable cut was dramatically increased. And you were in there, I guess, you were expressing yourself, you were issuing warnings to people in the bureaucracy and in the government and within the industry that if we keep things up at this pace, right, we're going to run out of economically viable timber. We're going to blow through our timber supply in very short order. I guess I'm curious to know, were they in denial? Or was it more than that? Did they understand what was going to happen with the timber supply? Yeah, what's your perspective on, like, what was the mindset of the people within the bureaucracy and within the government and within the industry about what was going on with all the salvage logging in the aftermath of the mountain pine beetle?
Yeah, no, good question. There was a lot going on. It was interesting in my research before I wrote the report, Getting the Balance Right. I met with the ex-chief forester of the day, Larry Pedersen, and we had a very in-depth talk, and I revealed to him my thoughts. At that time, I had already done a complete provincial review, and he was understanding of that. But I came across a presentation that he made to the UBC Faculty of Forestry back in 2003. And in that presentation, there's a lot of nuggets in there that sort of led me to how government was thinking at the time and how industry was thinking at the time, which led to the Forest and Range Practices Act and led to the beetle harvest and everything else. And there was a bit in that report that said that back in about that same time, as FERPA was coming into force, environmentalists, the environmental movement in BC, thought that 30 million cubic meters of wood per year was sustainable for British Columbia. Larry Pedersen, as the chief forester, thought it should be around 60. But he said industry wanted it to be somewhere between 100 and 150 million cubic meters of wood per year to cut down all the old primary forests as quickly as possible so that it can be replanted with these smaller, more manageable trees that would grow fast and thick and furious, and they could cut them every 60, 80 years and have this perpetual supply of wood. And Larry didn't agree with that. And of course, he was reassigned. He became deputy minister of the agriculture minister at the time. And but he never did agree with that. He won't say that publicly. And most deputy ministers and senior bureaucrats apply that level of confidence right to their grave, that they won't reveal a lot of discussion that took place. And rightly so. That's the way it should be. So it's up to us as investigators to find out what's going on. But what I found is that industry had such a stranglehold on government, their lobbyists, everybody that was involved in it, that government believed everything that industry was telling them. We need jobs, and government's responsibility is to provide jobs. And, where government is always in need of revenue coming in, and forestry was believed to be one of the big generators of revenue for the province, when it really wasn't in comparison to a lot of the other sectors that are out there. But most politicians have so much on their plate. They all come in with thoughts of making things better and creating an environment that everybody can succeed and entrepreneurs can succeed and everything else. But they get overwhelmed with information, and if it becomes too complex, a lot of them to start turning it off. And or a lot of them will start believing what the lobbyists are saying without doing any background checks on it, because it's easy. There's just so much on their plate. So as a result of that, industry lobbyists really have a stranglehold on government. Even today, they have a stranglehold on the governments, and governments are afraid to operate outside of that because it involves understanding a little bit more what's going on out there than what's really there. The people that really need the lobbyists are the scientists, the biologists, the hydrologists, the ecologists and whatnot that are working so hard out there. And I was telling one of my leaders in opposition, I said, for every government lobbyist that you meet, you need to sit down with a scientist and get the facts on what's going on the ground. But that never took place. So it was pyramided with lobbyists and information that was supporting the industry and the forest practices the way they are. It's been working this way for decades, so Mike must be wrong. It's working today, and we got all the people are working and whatnot. So they weren't looking into the future. And very few politicians, in my view, but very few people in general think strategically and think about 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the road or even more as to what things will look like, the impact on the land. And politicians aren't any different. They're, maybe 5% of them think strategically, and the rest think about this mess, this noise that's taking place right in front of them, and how they're going to resolve that for the next day. So what happened then was I was limited in my ability as a minister to participate in any forestry discussions because my ministry needed. I was a Solicitor General and the Public Safety Minister, and policing was an issue, and crime was an issue, and flooding was an issue. That was under my mandate as well, and that was something that we had to deal with. And forest fires was another thing under my mandate. So I'm dealing with I'm running the front end of the fire hose and trying to put the fires out. And I didn't have time to look behind me to figure out how we prevent that from happening in the first place. So being in government really confined you into these silos and basically unable to speak. Opposition wasn't much better, but I fared a little bit differently in opposition.
I think a lot of people outside looking in, who are concerned about what they're seeing on the land, have this sense that we don't have a reliable regulator overseeing the industry, and that there is no ideological distinction between the industry and the bureaucrats, the government officials who are supposed to be regulating the industry. And one of the prime examples of this was the chief forester, Diane Nichols, after her tenure going and working straight for Drax. And so I guess, like, people who have that impression, do you agree with that point of view? Do you feel like we have a regulatory body that is actually committed and that we can rely on in overseeing timber harvesting in the province? Or do we have a captured regulator?
Basically industry was given carte blanche access and control over the forest resources in the province through the introduction of the Forest and Drainage Practices Act and the accompanying regulations. And government did that intentionally because they saw government, one of the things behind a free enterprise government is create the conditions necessary for free enterprise to flourish. And I'm a free enterpriser too, but there has to be some guidelines in place at the end of the day. So by creating FERPA and giving all that authority and all that control to the forest industry, we kind of lost it. And we're still in that mode today. We still use FERPA as the basis. The Forest Act is there, and there's a number of different statutes looking after forestry in the province, but FERPA was the one that turned the regulatory power over to industry. It was a results-based, industry-led, market-driven legislation. And government really didn't have much control over that at all. So, and it hasn't changed much today.
All right, let's move forward into your time in opposition. And in that time, you actually authored an incredibly powerful report. This was the Can't See the Forest for the Trees report. And, tell me about your process in authoring that report and the findings of that report. And, and through that, it really gives us a grounding in, like, the big picture of what's going on in the forests of BC, what's the sorry state of the timber industry, and just how we got here. And, you were really able to apply all those investigative skills into authoring this report. So walk us through that report, how you made it, and the findings of it.
Yeah. The genesis for that was the frustration. I've been making these presentations every year to my caucus about the loss of habitat and the impacts of resource development, the cumulative impacts of resource development. But so that was part of it. The other part was that the original review that I did of loss of habitat in British Columbia, something really jumped out to me at that particular time, and that was the total focus of forest technicians, the chief foresters, people in industry on growth and yield only. And there wasn't one bit of interest in any of the other values on the land. And I was wondering, how the heck did we get to this particular point where we're so focused on growth and yield that we've given up everything else? We don't see anything else. That's why I call it, you can't see the forest for the trees. And but the other thing was when I was in opposition, I was getting pushback still from my own caucus members. Very uncomfortable. A lot of them were when I would stand up and make my different speeches in the House about loss of biodiversity and on. But I attribute it to the fact that they didn't have a good understanding of the forest sector and how we got to where we are today and the path that led us to this particular spot. So I thought, okay, I'm going to go way back to the beginning, 1910, the first Royal Commission on Forestry, the first Forest Act, the beginning of the BC Forest Service, and all those types of things, and work my way from there forward. And so I started reading. I read all of the Royal Commission reports on forestry from 1910, 1945, another one in 1955, and the last one was in 1976. That's 50 years ago. And so I went through 1910, and you could extrapolate a lot of information. I read a lot of the witness statements and stuff for that, and you could extrapolate a lot of what was going on then to today. Like they wanted certainty, they wanted the volume to invest into forestry and those kinds of things, and but there was unregulated licenses been issued all over the place with no real guidelines in place. So that was the impetus behind the 1910 Royal Commission. And as a result of that, we got the Forest Act and BC Forest Service. And so the 1945 report was to the 1943, I think they started that Royal Commission. Second World War was still going on, but forestry hadn't really taken off in British Columbia. They were looking at ways to enhance forestry, to make sure that we were doing it in a sustainable fashion. And so what struck me, and it was page 127 of the report. I just can't remember exactly where it was. But as I'm reading through this report, I come across the recommendation, the genesis for the recommendation that the commissioner made of the day, that BC adopt a sustainable yield strategy moving forward. That was based upon having a perpetual supply of wood in the province at the local level to have jobs forever and incomes forever for people coming in. But he said the forests are more than just fiber and wood for sawmilling. The forests provide air, clean air and water and biodiversity. He didn't use these exact words, but he said, I don't need to take that into consideration for the sustainable yield strategy because, it's we just have so much wood here. We'll never be able to have an impact on that part of it. So we have to bear in mind that when he made this suggestion or this recommendation to government of the day, that he was basing it on all the evidence that he had heard prior to, between 1943 and 44 when he wrote his report for 1945. And it was based on 1930s logging technology. It was based on we had trees that averaged on the coast. Some of them were probably 4 and 5 cubic meters per tree, maybe some even bigger than that. In the interior of the province here, up in Prince George, and there's very little. There was some logging going on up here for ties and whatnot, but the trees at that particular time probably averaged at least 1 to 2 cubic meters, maybe some of them 3 cubic meters in size. And today's wood it takes 10 trees to make a cubic meter. So everything was based on that. And it was his belief at the time, reading everything that I read, is that we would never be able to log trees. So by the time 120 years, because that's what a rotation was considered to be in the interior, these trees would be growing back again and we'd just have this perpetual supply of wood. But at that time he didn't envision, and neither did any politician envision, that we would have the types of equipment that we have today. But the 1976 one, the last one we had 50 years ago, was the first time I saw them talking about the other values on the land. And it was interesting with the commissioner for that Royal Commission report. He basically said, folks, and I'm paraphrasing here, he said, British Columbia and the forest sector in British Columbia has thrived on the old growth timber that we have. And it's been of high quality. It's been well regarded around the world because of the tight growth rings on it. The fiber was of excellent quality. But he said, when that's gone, we will lose our competitive advantage. And because it cannot be duplicated in a reasonable time frame. And of course, it took thousands of years for that to happen in the first place. So he brought that to the attention of people of government in 1976, and it got pushed back. And if you look at all the different charts for annual allowable cuts and stuff, it kept on going up in 1976. There was a little bit of a blip down, but then it went back up again in the 80s and 90s, and of course in the 2000s with the pine beetle. But my discussion in that report also talks about the silviculture practices we started clear cutting in about 1965 in BC, and we didn't replant as frequently or in the density that natural regen provided, or with the same trees that industry wanted trees that grew quick and prolifically. So the federal government helped out in the 1980s, and they brought in some assistance, and we really started replanting in earnest in the 1980s, and we started planting 1,500 2,000 stems per hectare of of lodgepole pine, because it grows fast. It was considered a weed tree up until we started clear cutting. And so we started doing that, and the density of these trees, they grew up dense. There was a lot of natural regen in that, because what they were doing is they started planting lodgepole pine and predominantly spruce balsam area, a little bit damper, a little cooler, different ecology in those areas. And they changed the ecology completely by planting these pine trees. And then what happened over the years, the pine trees would grow, and they were very dense. And then if you factor in the hydrological studies that Unisalila has been doing, that says clear cutting is causing increased frequency, magnitude, duration of floods and whatnot, leads to drought and leads to a lot of other things. Then all those factors are multiplied when we have these dense plantations, like throwing a match down into dry grass, and it just takes off and blows and very quickly out of control. So I had all these things laid out you can't see the forest for the trees, so my colleagues would get a better understanding of what was going on out there. And but I guess the result was they changed critics, and I was hoping that I would receive the nod for being the critic, but industry again has a lot of lobbying going on with opposition as well as government, and it would have caused heartache for my leader and caucus if I was purported to be saying no more forestry. I've never said no more forestry. I've said no more forest practices that are leading to the disastrous outcomes that we see today. We have to change how we do business. But nobody ever picked up on that.
Mike, could you give us a little bit of an overview of the legislative history of forestry in BC? You've kind of touched on some of this, but I feel like you could string this out for us, just how the legislation has changed over the years, bringing us up to FERPA and even the latest amendments from the current BC NDP government. Do you mind walking us through that legislative history?
Yeah, the earlier legislation was formatted more around the administrative part of forestry, because they wanted to encourage more logging. And back in 1920, 1930, 50s and stuff like that, you're trying to encourage more forestry, so more logging. And but by the time we got into the 80s, I think the writing was on the wall that more regulatory provisions needed to be brought in, because there was a bit of a free-for-all out on the land. We started handing out tenure back in the 70s and early 80s, and a lot of people got rich from that. And that's free enterprise. But it also impacted the availability of wood on the land. So when back in the 90s, government brought in the Forest Practices Code. And it was, industry referred to it as very prescriptive, and it increased their costs because they had to do all these different things in order to cut the trees down.
And that was that in response to the war in the woods and the blockades that were happening in the international market campaigns?
Yeah, it was. A lot of that was going on back in that particular time. As a police officer, I was involved in a lot of that with respect to the civil disobedience that were taking place in different areas. But yeah, we did have that dissent that civil dissent taking place right across the province. So government looked at that and they said, yeah, we do need to rein it in a little bit. We need to put some restrictions on how we cut the trees down and when we cut them down and how much we can cut and all those kinds of things. And that started manifesting itself towards the late 1990s. And so the government of the day changed in 2001. And there was a lot of lobbying with the BC Liberals at the time. And they said, yeah, we're going to look at that. We're going to change that. And they spent a lot of time. It was one of their number one priorities when they got elected to change the legislation and develop the Forest and Range Practices Act, which was the market-driven, industry-led statute. And so a lot of work put into that, and it basically abandoned all of the good things that the Forest Practices Code had. And there were some complicated things within that statute that needed to be adjusted as well. But the Forest and Range Practices Act came in, and the regulations, and part of the regulations, and this really got me when I was doing a review of the legislation, where the Forest and Range Practices Act kind of lays out the foundation of how this is going to work. And the regulations put the meat on the bones for that particular legislation. So the objectives, government refers to it in the legislation as the objective set by government for biodiversity and water and air and all these kinds of things. And the regulations had the 9 objectives set by government. And so industry had to do all these marvelous things to ensure that we had protected the riparian areas, we looked after the wildlife habitat and those 9 objectives that we had. But I called it an off-ramp clause in each of those objectives that said that they had to do all these wonderful things unless it affected the amount of timber available for harvest. And to me, that just threw it all out the window. That's a default clause that say, well, we'd love to do all these things, but it affects the amount of timber that we can cut. So
this is the unduly clause. It must not unduly restrict the supply of timber.
Yeah, that's the unduly clause. So in my report, Getting the Balance Right, I had recommended that be removed from the regulations, from the legislation. But not only that, so in the regulations you have those 9 objectives set by government, but then you have about 3 pages of regulations that basically will exempt industry from having to comply. And it's if they do one little thing in that direction, then they're exempt from having to follow through with the rest of it. So the whole regulatory system was set up to cut everything in sight.
I want to go back to FERPA, to the Forest and Range Practices Act for a second, because I think this is really important. Can you tell us about the process of writing that legislation? I know it was a little before your time, but my understanding is that there were industry lawyers that were very involved in that process. Could you shine some light on that for us?
Yeah, it was interesting. When I first read FERPA, when I was doing my review in 2015, I read it and I thought, geez, this looks like industry wrote it. And I reread it again and I highlighted a bunch of things in it. And I'm thinking, geez, this is an industry piece of legislation. And and I was still in the good books with industry as the Parliamentary Secretary for Forestry when the BC Liberals had a fundraising function in the Lower Mainland, and there was 1,000 or more people there. And I was invited to sit at one of the major licensees' tables. So with the senior vice presidents and whatnot, there's about 10 people sitting at the table, all of them big donors. And so I'm sitting beside this guy, and we talked about my review, and I hadn't made my presentation to Kofi yet, of course. And he said, so what do you think of that, the Forest and Range Practices Act? I said, I looked at it, and it looks like you guys wrote it. And he said, we did. And he was very proud of that. And, so my inquiries into that after that, it was a little light bulb that went off in my investigative mind. And I talked to senior people that were involved with that process at that time. A lot of them had left government, and they didn't divulge, they didn't breach their level of confidentiality that they had to maintain, But I ended up with enough information to realize that there was a dozen or more of these industry representatives, lawyers, that were gathered at the Grand Pacific Hotel in Victoria for a 2-week period to put the meat into the legislation at that particular time on behalf of government. It was government provided the facility and probably covered the cost, who knows. But that was the impetus for the development of the Forest and Drainage Practices Act, and I think that occurred in late 2001 or early 2002.
Wow. I mean, I heard that in an interview once before that Anthony Britneff, who's a retired forestry, he worked in the Ministry of Forests, I believe, for 40 years or something like that. And he was there in an office down the hall, you know, as that process was unfolding. And it just makes me wonder, and I think he wondered at the time too, like, is this legal? Like,
Yeah, you know, it's not illegal, and you know, government is still the gatekeeper for that at the end of the day, but it does show the bias that was written into that particular legislation, and kudos to whoever thought about it or ever thought of that, because as a free enterpriser, wouldn't you like to have a piece of legislation that is lets you just give carte blanche access to whatever you want to do out there, and it wasn't illegal. It's got complications, but that shows you how short-sighted government was and still is, you know, when they're looking at the future and what we got. But it also shows the focus was on growth and yield, because at the same time that this was written, we had other bureaucrats come into government and say, oh my goodness, we have just found out that all of those lodgepole pine trees that we've been planting over the last years are growing 30 to 40% faster than what we ever imagined. And we're going to have more trees available to us as a result of these fast growing forests. And so as a result of that, and as a result of industry's quest to reach that 150 million cubic meters of wood per year to get rid of all the big trees and turn the province into this massive managed forest, the rate of cut went up, and we lost all these trees. Now, over the years, and you know, probably about 5 years ago, I heard from forest professionals that said, we're in trouble here because those trees aren't growing 30 to 40% faster. They're growing at the same rate that we had predicted back before they had this 30-40% increase. And you talk to the likes of experts like Dave Raddy's and Martin Watts, who wrote that report that Business in Vancouver released here a few weeks ago, that shows we're in trouble. It's not growing as fast as everybody thought it would be. There might be some select areas where we're seeing some pretty significant growth, but in general, overall, the trees aren't growing back as quickly as we had wanted, and we're missing the height. And the height of those conifer trees is what adds to the hydrological integrity of the land base. You know, the higher the tree, the greater the canopy, the more they can disperse the snow and the rain, and the more that gets evaporated back up into the atmosphere again to create precipitation down the road. So all of that kind of takes place there. But yeah, that was a profound mistake, I think, that we should be recognizing today and turning the dial way back to adjust. You know, as we're moving forward here, you know, people want to say, look at what we're doing today. We're developing, we're leaving more trees on the land base. We're harvesting way less than we used to, but that's because we don't have anything left to harvest.
Can you tell me, would you mind walking us through sort of the evolution of the forestry practices that we've seen on the land? Because they have changed a lot over the years, from, you know, hand falling and, you know, steam donkeys to the introduction of trucks and chainsaws to the introduction of feller bunchers and you know, just the acceleration that comes along with that mechanization, you know, some of the automation that's happened in the sawmilling to deal with that that increased ability to harvest timber. So just walk us through how forestry practices have changed over the years with technology, and also like how that's affected the level of employment in the industry.
Oh, you bet. Forestry was labor intensive. The beginning of the 20th century, horse logging, they brought in the steam donkeys, these things that they would build on top of trees and skid them from using the donkey to skid it from place to place and to bring all these trees out. But they also built these railways into all the different remote areas, particularly on the island, but in the interior here as well, to haul the wood to a mill. And there was mills all over the place. But can you imagine, back in the turn of the century, a tree that is 20 feet around at the butt? And we didn't have any power saws back in those days, so everything was these big crosscut saws and axes. How many days it would take a couple of guys to cut one of these big trees down? And those trees would probably be, 4 or 5 cubic meters of wood in one tree. And then, of course, we changed to mechanized equipment, and after the war, we had diesel engines all over the place and cats and loaders. But then things changed, and the sawmills got bigger, particularly when we lost the appurtency and we built these super mills around the province. Like the average mill in the fort when I worked there back in the 70s, they might have cut 20, 30 loads a day, maybe 50 loads a day, which was a lot back in those days. And the new mills that we have, like Dunkley just down the road between Prince George and Quesnel here, that mill will consume 2 million cubic meters worth of wood every year. And that equates to 150 loads of logging truck loads a day going into the mill. And this thing just burns through the wood. And they modernized the mill, and prior to modernization, they would have 30, 35 folks, 40 folks working on the floor per shift, doing all the different jobs they had. And then after the modernization, which cost millions of dollars to do, they only had 7. And then on the ground in the bush, we would have, instead of having 3 or 4 or 5 haulers, we brought in feller bunchers. And they were, cumbersome machines back in the early days, and it took a lot of, you could hear them working at night, and the saw would go right down to 0 RPM from cutting through some of these bigger trees. And we moved from there to these harvesters nowadays that cut and process and trim the wood into whatever length that you want it to, and then carefully pile it so that it can be loaded by another button top loader onto a truck. You don't have to drag it into a landing anymore. So that's eliminated probably 80% of the workforce that was required to log all the wood in the first place. And then we've gone from, I had a brother-in-law that had trucks, and I learned how to drive truck, and the 5-axle trucks, and we would load it heavy, we thought, at the time, with maybe 25 meters of wood at the most on it, depending on where you were. And today, where we've got these 8, 9, and 10 axle trucks working in the central interior here that will haul 40, 45, 50 cubic meters of wood in one foul shot there. And so you can haul longer distances at a cheaper rate with one guy driving a truck. You get, in these machines out in the bush, you've got your feller buncher, you've got your processor, and then you got your button top loader, and they're all on these swinging platforms. And it takes a bit of finesse to learn how to run processors and all those kinds of things, but these guys get to the point where they can just jump from one machine to the other if they have to. And so it's really reduced the amount of people that we have working in the bush. So I look at this and I can understand it to a degree, but when I hear companies and corporations saying they're really concerned about the loss of labor and the workforce that they have, and they're blaming it on the environmentalists and they're blaming it on everybody else, I think they have to look in the mirror and see that they are responsible for probably a 75% drop in employment in the forest sector because of automation and because of all these bigger, more efficient machines that we have.
And that, I think, is a really important point that we need to touch on here, is the state of the timber supply in BC. And when I see people out there working for industry who are calling for solutions like we need faster permitting, right? We need access to new markets, right? It's the complicated regulations that are leading to the closure of these mills and, the decline in the forestry employment. But they never seem to acknowledge, they will say we have lack of access to economically viable fiber, but they tend to blame the government regulations. They tend to blame a high operating cost. Give us a reality check on what is the current state of the timber supply in BC and how did it get to this point?
We've squandered it. We're simply out of wood. It's just as simple as that. The industry, their vision back in 2003, according to Larry Patterson, was to increase the annual allowable cut to 100 million cubic meters or more per year. And Larry didn't like that, so Larry got pushed aside. Industry got their way. They were able to raise that AAC, and they used it under the premises of we're saving the world from the beetles. This is one of the terms they use. We're going to sanitize the forest so we don't have to worry about these beetles anymore, and save British Columbians. But what they did is they used that as a premise to cut all the greenwood that was in the area as well. And a lot of the blocks that I walked through, and I walked through a lot of blocks up here over the last 20, 30 years or more. And, you might have pine beetle coming through. And one of the areas that I was trapping was predominantly lodgepole pine, but it had some balsam and other wood in there. But not all the pine died. But yet they went in and they cut it all down. And another area was predominantly, and it's a large 3,000 hectare clear cut that every licensee in the Prince George area partook in, but it was predominantly spruce and balsam with some Doug fir in there. And they cut it all down on the premise that the spruce beetle was in there, but there was no sign of spruce beetle when I walked through that area maybe a year or so prior to the cut. And I've been keeping my eye on the spruce beetle because my whole riding was affected by it. So they just clear cut the whole works down. And when you look at all of the area that had been logged over the last 20 years around it, it was like 50, 60, 70,000 hectares of clear cuts over the last 25 years. So, this is where we got kind of pushed into. And industry still wants that. So they are, they've got this coalition now of unions, of industry, of advocacy groups, the Truck Loggers Association, whatnot in there, advocating to go back. We're going to save the world. Only forestry can save British Columbia because we know better. So we can go and they want access to all the old growth forest that's left because that's bad. It's going to cause fires. And we want access to the protected areas as well because those areas are going to cause fires for everybody. And we're going to put people to work and we're going to make housing more affordable and we're going to do this and we're going to do that. Basically, they're gaslighting the public into making them believe that forestry is going to be the savior. None of that is science-based. None of that, there's a few reports that are coming out right now about how fires spread and the landscape contributions to making fires spread and whatnot. A lot of that is not peer-reviewed science. A lot of that is just looking at data and coming to some kind of an opinion or conclusion based on that data. But if you start looking at the science that's out of Australia, which gets lots of fires, coming out of the States, particularly in the California area, which gets lots of fires, it contradicts a lot of the things that they're saying here in British Columbia moving forward. So we're in tough shape. We are out of wood. And no matter what anybody says, they say Mike Morris is wrong, we're right, and this scientist over here is wrong, industry is right, government is right, so we're going to carry on doing it. The outcome is going to be the same. We are out of wood. We have placed British Columbia in a critical position when it comes to the hydrological integrity of the watershed, according to research. We have put people out of work because we have squandered the resource that we've got. No doubt about it. It's going to take us decades to recover.
Absolutely. It seems like they are trying to run the same playbook again that they ran in the aftermath of the mountain pine beetles, positioning the timber industry as the wildfire saviors of BC. Now they're using the fear, that the very real fear that people have about wildfires on the landscape, to try and use that as an argument to access protected areas, to try and access what little old growth forest is left. But I've seen a lot of the same science that you've seen, and clear-cut logging and replanting these dense conifer plantations seems to only increase the fire risk over time by depleting the resiliency of the natural forests on the landscape. And the thing that they always tend to sort of leave out when they're talking about how logging is going to save us from wildfires by doing fuel reduction, they never want to talk about the flood risk. And in the aftermath of the mountain pine beetle, I mean, the scale of the clear cutting that they engaged in, and I've been out there and seen, like cut blocks that are thousands of hectares in size. And, this kind of goes to what you were saying earlier about there being, loopholes and off-ramps within the legislation. It seems like you shouldn't be allowed to log cut blocks that are, over 1,000 hectares in size, but they did. And a lot of that was based on little loopholes that they created where, if they're mimicking they're mimicking a natural disturbance, or they're dealing with an insect infestation, that then gave them the ability within the legislation to log these massive cut blocks. And according to the science of Dr. Eunice Alila, who I've worked closely with in my documentary Trouble in the Headwaters, that clear-cut logging has increased the frequency and the magnitude of floods dramatically in the province, leading to floods in Merritt and Princeton and Grand Forks and many other places. You've been a huge champion of Dr. Alila's research. I don't know if there's anything else that you can add to this. What do we need to be looking out for? What does the industry need to be thinking about moving forward when it comes to hydrology, when it comes to floods and landslides and droughts?
Yeah, industry's foundation today is that trees either die and fall down and rot, or they burn. Nothing else. That's what they're looking at. And that's what they're preying upon British Columbians who don't understand forestry and all the ramifications or all the values of a forest out there. The evapotranspiration part of it, where forests provide up to 50% or more of regional or continental precipitation. That's phenomenal when you look at that. But I'm concerned over that. When just looking at the liability factor alone with respect to loss of life, people that have life-changing injuries that for forever, people who have lost their homes, people who have lost their businesses, ranchers that have lost property, like you see with the Wineglass Ranch in the Chilcotin from the Chilcotin Slide. All of those things that are there, but the loss of life is paramount to me as a former public safety officer. We've had people die. Look at the Duffy Lake slide that killed 5 people, and we've had people die in wildfires. And if the cause of the floods, of the increased frequency, magnitude, and duration of floods, if the cause of the landslides, if a significant contributing factor to our wildfires is the dryness of the land and the loss of groundwater retention and all that stuff attributable to clear-cut logging, why hasn't government stepped forward?
Well, I think that those liabilities coming down the line and some of these court cases that are in the works right now make it really difficult for the government to acknowledge this science and acknowledge the impacts, because they know that they're at the receiving end of a number of lawsuits for these very things right now.
Well, exactly. And that's, a lot of the structure of my speeches in the House over the last 4 or 5 years that I was in was framed around Eunice Alila's research and the liabilities and the risks associated to carrying on in that fashion. Over the past 15 years, forest hydrology studies from UBC have now linked the loss of forest cover to the rapid melting of snow in snow-dominated regions of BC. Rapid snow melt contributes to increased flood events in every watershed subjected to the loss of forest cover. So government can't say we weren't aware of it. When some judge decides to go to the government and say, Mr. Government, why did you continue clear cutting when you knew as far back as 2019 or 2017 or whatever the date was, that this was a liability risk that the province needed to take into consideration? So why did you carry on doing this? Industry, why have you carried on doing that when the Forest Practices Board have cited Eunice's research back in 2016 or even before that, and showing that the cause of all this is clear-cut logging? So there's going to be questions that are going to be needed to be answered, and I'm sure there's a lot of legal counsel for the forest licensees and for government that are losing sleep every night wondering how they're going to fight that in court.
Absolutely. Mike, I would be remiss as a journalist if I didn't ask you this one question, which is that, the fact of the matter is, obviously this was before your time when FERPA got introduced by the BC Liberal government in the Gordon Campbell years. But you were part of government at the time that a lot of this was sort of unfolding, and I know that you were pushing back within caucus. Do you ever wish you'd pushed harder? Do you ever wish you'd been able to be more outspoken during your time within government? I'm because you became very outspoken in opposition, and I'm sure you were internally as well, and it's a little before my time as well. But I'm curious to know if you wish you'd pushed harder or done more during your time in government to try and push back against the actions of your own party.
Yeah, of course, hindsight is always 20/20, and could I've done things differently? Yes, but at the same time, I had to balance being a team member. So I was part of the BC Liberal Party. I was a cabinet minister in government, and you have responsibilities not only to your caucus colleagues and the party, but to government as well. So I was trying to find that balance on how I could ensure that the decision makers were seized with the information without being kicked out. Because once you're kicked out, or once you become sitting as an independent member, you lose a lot of ability to speak publicly on that. And so there was a balance that I was trying to foster there. And it's much like being in an undercover operation where you're trying to avail yourself to the bad guys and make it look like you're a badass individual as well. But you're still beholden to the law, and you're still beholden to peace and order and all that kind of stuff. So it's that balance that you're trying to exercise during that period of time. And I genuinely joined the BC Liberals because I'm a free enterpriser, and I'm a federal conservative. I believe in that. But there's limits to what has to be done, and you can't just swallow that Kool-Aid thinking that everything's going to be okay at the end of the day. So it was a balancing act. It was a frustrating balancing act, and it's a good thing that BC makes quality wine, because otherwise that'd be a basket case.
Absolutely. And I'm definitely not a partisan, and I do want to also talk quickly about, the current government of the day and the direction that the current BC NDP government is going with forestry. They have made this commitment to 45 million cubic meters, getting to that goal. Our current Minister of Forests, Ravi Parmar, he's going to all the conventions. He seems to be listening to a lot of the industry talking points and the industry arguments, not really paying much attention to the conservation side of the equation right now. The old growth review seems to be out the window, and the BC timber sales review is kind of, and those recommendations are more at the forefront of their agenda. I'm curious to know if you have an assessment of the current Minister of Forests, the current government direction, and actually, and maybe I'll play this clip. Actually, you went on Daybreak North, and you'd made some statements critical of the industry and just laying out a lot of what you've said today, that we've run out of wood. And about a week later, Ravi Parmar went on and said, Mike Morris, where were you when you were in government? So he kind of called you and put you on blast. Anyway, I'll play that clip, which was kind of a funny back and forth.
People really don't understand, politicians really don't understand what's happening with our forest sector right now. In fact, a lot of people in British Columbia don't. We don't have the capacity to double production, to double our exports to any country. And because the wood is just not there, we have unsustainably harvested for the last, for probably for several decades, but particularly the last 20, 25 years.
I would say to Mike Morris, pick a side, man. What side are you on? Are you on the side of forestry workers? Are you on the side helping to transform this sector? Or are your intentions now to shut down this sector? I don't know what Mike Morris is up to these days. I don't have a lot of time for a guy that really has no plan for forestry. But let me tell you what my plan for forestry is, Carolina, in the time that I have left. I want to help transform this sector. I want to help ensure that we can build that strong, sustainable sector. And let me assure you and your listeners, the fiber is out there. Our biggest challenge right now is accessing economical fiber.
Tell us, what is your assessment of the current direction of the BC NDP government and who they're listening to right now?
They're listening to David Eby. He's a very controlling individual, and it's either his way or the highway. He thinks he has the answer to everything. Ravi Parmar got elected when I was still in the House, and a very eloquent speaker, and he can think fast on his feet as far as speaking goes. But he's a 30-year-old impressionable young man. And he gets immersed into this forestry file of which he knew nothing about. And he gets fed all this stuff by all these industry supporting associations and the unions and whatnot. And all the union officials came to meet with me as well, but they didn't like my response, I guess. So, he's doing the job that he thinks he needs to do. And I admire him for that. But I would like to talk to him again when he's got a few more gray hairs and wrinkles. He's got a few miles under his belt. He's 30 years old. He's been living in Langford all his life. I don't think he's got a very good understanding of how a forest works province-wide. It's different on the island versus the interior of the province. He doesn't know, and I mentioned it earlier, evapotranspiration. Like, what is the value of transpiration? Like, there's research now from different scientists around the world, physicists and whatnot, that show that the greatest value of a forest is providing regional, continental, and transcontinental rainfall, precipitation. So if we're seeing drought outside of British Columbia, and including in BC, regionally, could that have anything to do with the loss of forest cover in BC? I know they're finding that with the Amazon. It's affected the amount of rainfall that's going down into the southern part of South America for the agriculture sector down there. So there's so much that we need to look at. And I would doubt that the minister has sat down with any scientist to discuss those kinds of things that are taking place. So he's only got a very lopsided, biased perspective on what forests are all about in BC. So, and government is stymied, of course, by the dictator that they have in charge of everything. And, I got along okay with David Eby, but he does think that his is the only way, his is the only opinion that's worthwhile. There's this new report out by the Provincial Forest Advisory Council. Funny enough, they've got a lot of recommendations in there that I had back in my 2015 report. And I don't think that's going to see the light of day either. So Rob Shaw says in a recent article that he had on the Northern Beat that there's been 60 reviews by this NDP government since they came in 2017, and nothing has come to fruition as a result of those 60 reviews on forestry. So this will be number 61.
And what about that push by the industry and the commitment from the government to try and get to 45 million cubic meters harvest volume? What do you think of that?
That's an arbitrary number produced by the industry themselves. It's not scientifically based. It's not supported by the science. The chief forester. So there's this delta between what the chief forester had predicted. We can cut 60 million cubic meters of wood. We only cut 30 million last year, so that must mean we've got 30 million that nobody's cutting right now. And why aren't we doing that? They blame it on policy. They blame it on everything else. But it's not there. It has been overestimated. So, and I've got letters through Freedom of Information with previous chief foresters and ministers where the minister is basically saying, I want you to err on the side of socioeconomics rather than on sustainability. So progressively over the last 20 years or so, the chief forester has been forced into a corner by making all these erroneous assumptions that has raised the AAC to a certain level. And now he's got to rationalize it at the end of the day, but the wood's not there. And so I don't think, the 45 million is not there. I know it's not there. I've been out and around, and you've been out and around, and if anybody looks at Google Earth time lapse, they'll know that we don't have 45 million annually to cut. I don't know what the number should be. I think that we have so badly overcut that we're going to have to haul everything way back. Would 10 million be too much? I don't know. I've often said to people in the past that I don't think we have enough forests left to provide wood for our domestic market, let alone export. And we need to really take a hard look at that at the end of the day. We need our forests to recover that hydrological integrity, but we also need them to recover so that we can get rid of the drought. We can start producing more rain through the evapotranspiration aspects of a complete forest at the end of the day. The biodiversity would come back, the wildlife would come back, and all the other aspects, clean water would come back. So we have a lot to do here. This 45 million cubic meters is an arbitrary number that was introduced by industry. And I'm sorry, industry, but you don't have the credibility any longer to introduce anything with respect to AACs.
And it seems like the push is on to try and get access to old growth management areas and even provincial parks in order to achieve that number. Now, I'm aware that the province has suppressed fire across BC for many decades. A lot of these forests, especially in the north and in the interior, these were fire maintained ecosystems, and with our clear cutting and replanting these dense plantations, we've got these very unnaturally dense and flammable I won't even call them forests, plantations on the landscape. So I accept that there may be a need for some careful forestry and silviculture and thinning in order to reduce that fire risk. Probably also some things like prescribed burns and cultural burning, but the industry is very much pushing for active forest management to sort of like deal with fuel loads as to lower the fire risk in the province. I guess what should we be watching out for? Is there legitimate forestry and some management that should be happening, or is this sort of a Trojan horse for just more industrial logging?
Yeah, as far as I'm concerned, it's a Trojan horse, and that's after reading a lot of the science that supports how we should be moving forward with forestry and ecology and hydrology and everything else in balance in the future here. So we do need to get into our managed forest stands. We've probably got 20 million plus hectares of these new densely planted monoculture conifers across the province here. And we need to get into them sooner than later and start thinning them out. But we can't, the commercial thinning is running a big 14-foot wide feller buncher down the road and reaching out as far as you can and cutting all the trees down. And you leave this big swath, and then you move over 20 meters and make another swath down the other side. That's not what we need. We need these small machines to go in and selectively cut individual trees throughout this process and let the other ones grow a little bit more vigorously, get the height that we needed and whatnot. But that's going to take us decades to do. It's going to be labor intensive. We're going to create a lot of jobs by doing that. If we have, there's these small machines that they've had in Finland and other areas over there. It look like a big ATV with these different attachments on them that can go in and cut all these individual trees without making these big swaths. It takes a lot longer. You probably have to work all day to cut these little, 6 or 8 inch trees down to make a load to haul to a local facility if you've got one. But it's labor intensive, and you're going to have to change your manufacturing techniques and everything else. We don't have, in my humble opinion, we don't have enough diameter in these new plantations to make 2x4s. Maybe, the odd one you can make a 2x6 out of, but most of the wood's going to have to be chipped. And we need chip wood, for the pulp mills. Are we going to end up with only one pulp mill in the province and having to ship all these chips down to it? Perhaps. Is pulpwood the most efficient way to use the resources that we have? We've got biofuels, we've got pellet plants, we've got all kinds of different uses for chips and wood products today that we didn't have 10 years ago. So we need to look at the highest value for the product that we have available to us. But we got to get started on that, because that is the fire hazard. That's these densely planted forests out there is the fire hazard that's going to cause the grief for British Columbians.
And my last question for you here today, Mike, is, we've laid out a lot of the problems and the challenges that we're facing, and there's a lot of people in this audience who see that for themselves firsthand. They're very worried, they're very concerned, and they want to know, what needs to change? Where do we go next? What are you calling for? What's your vision for the type of forest industry that we need? How do we get there? What are you calling for, Mike?
We need to have a science-based forest sector, and science-based legislation moving forward. This volume-based era that we've gone through for the past number of decades now is wrong, and is proven wrong. So why are we continuing to ride that dead horse into the ground? We've got the science that says the clear cutting is causing increased fires and landslides and whatnot. So we need to stop what we're doing, period. Just stop it. Pull the plug on FERPA and stop cutting volume-based. Go to an area-based tenure system like was recommended by this Forest Advisory Council report. But looking at how we can get into these massive amounts of managed forests that we have and thin them out scientifically so that we enhance growth, and we can go in there and start practicing some kind of select logging process. Every year you go in, you cut the wood, and 20 years later it's a little bit bigger and you got something else that you can use out of that. But we have to change our mind away from we're hooked on this cocaine of large trees and volume-based logging, and if your profit is only a nickel a tree, but you have to put 1 million trees through to make that nickel a tree, is that worth it at the end of the day with all the other costs that are associated with that? Particularly when industry and us as taxpayers are going to be paying for the liability associated to the floods and loss of life and wildfires and everything else caused by the clear-cut logging.
One more question, actually, just in follow up to that. When I articulate sort of a similar vision of, we need to go in, we need to thin these areas out, we need to operate more scientifically, we need to be more careful, we need to live lighter on the land. People will often say, well, how are we going to make money doing that? What are the economics of that? And it seems to me like the very vital and necessary work that we need to do is not going to be profitable work, right? And in fact will actually be very costly, likely to the public. What is the economic case that we make, or how do we change the economics so that we make the work that we need to do, that it actually gets done, and the work that we don't want to see, the kind of destructive practices that we've seen in the past, is no longer driving our forestry in this province?
Yeah, necessity is the mother of invention, and I think the answers will develop as we move forward with a ecologically focused resource stewardship, is the way to put it. And I like the way UBC has changed their program name to the Forest and Resource Stewardship faculty, because that's the way we have to look at that. But we have to, forestry is costing us money. Forestry, we're not making much money in forestry anymore if we look at the damage that we have to pay for the floods and the fires and the loss of life and everything else. There's people going to be out of work as a result of doing forestry the way we're doing it today. But there's more opportunities. We've got all kinds of potential with critical minerals and mining and oil and gas and those kinds of things that a lot of people don't like, but they're jobs. And but we don't have those jobs in forestry the way we're doing it today. We will have jobs available in some way when we go in and thin all these plantations out. Now, I know there's a lot of work being done as to how we can make money doing that. We can make money doing anything if there's a market for the product that we have at the end of the day. And but we just have to get there. But right now, we've got our head buried in this 75-year paradigm of cutting big trees down and making as many 2x4s out of it as we can, and then burning the rest up. And we have to get rid of that and start looking at. And nobody's cornered the market on good ideas yet. So if we get some young entrepreneur out there looking at it and says, geez, I can do this and I can make $10 on this. And if I have 2 of these machines, I can make $20 on this. I think the answer is going to start showing up, but we have to stop what we're doing right now, because the recovery from that for taxpayers in British Columbia and the liability associated to that is onerous. It's going to cost more at the end of the day than carrying on with what we're doing.
And I know there's people out there who are calling for a new Forest Act. I've heard you call for a new public inquiry. Just final thoughts on, how does the legislation need to change, and what are you calling for? What's your call for a public inquiry?
Yeah, public inquiry is EB did that in a way by appointing this Forest Advisory Council. They've got the report in right now where they've made a number of these recommendations. And I've read through that, and the recommendations are broad enough that it allows a lot of room to maneuver. The new legislation, it's going to be required. There's no question about it. We're going to need the complete rewrite of all resource-based legislation, including mining and oil and gas and that, because of the ecological stuff that we know. Legislation takes a long time to catch up to the science. And we are so far behind in that right now. It's going to take a concentrated effort to sit down with the scientists and the legislature drafters and everybody else to come up with legislation that fits not today's environment in BC, but the environment in BC for 25 years down the road as a minimum, and start from there. But carry on with our mining, carry on with our oil and gas, carry on with all those things, pull the plug on FERPA, or at least pull the plug on whatever is causing old growth to disappear, and clear cutting to continue, and keep those sections that will allow us to go in and do the thinning that's necessary until we can get to that new legislation that will be the basis for resource development moving forward.
Mike Morris, thank you so much for joining me today on the Cut Block. I really appreciate your time and insight. And I appreciate you being the very first guest on this channel, on this podcast. And I hope to have you back many more times in the future.
Thanks very much for the opportunity, Dan.